In 1974, in a house near the river in Amityville, Ronald wakes up, seeing strange visions and hearing voices telling him to catch someone and take them out. When the clock strikes 3:15, Ronald loads his weapon and moves from room to room, shooting his entire family. Jody hears the shots and tries to hide in the closet with her favorite bear, but Ronald finds her and her after telling her he loves her. This case appears on the news and shocks the entire nation, especially when Ronald says that the house told him to do it. 1 year later, George and Kathy live happily together as newlyweds. Kathy has 3 children from a previous marriage. While Michael likes George just fine, Billy and Chelsea aren't very fond of him. One afternoon, the couple goes out to look for a new house and ends up driving around Amityville, which George thinks they can't afford. Kathy doesn't care, and when she sees the beautiful house near the river, she calls the realtor for a visit. The house is huge, and George can't understand why its price is so low. Kathy notices a black stain on the ceiling but doesn't think much of it, and George admits he likes the boathouse outside because he owns a speedboat. There are strange noises in the corridor that the realtor hears but ignores, while the couple looks around. When they reach the basement, the realtor refuses to go down there. The couple goes anyway, and George finds a clock stuck at 3:15. After the tour, Kathy convinces George to buy the house, even if they have to cut back on expenses for a few months, as the deal is too good to pass up. George hesitates but agrees, asking the realtor where the catch is. The realtor finally admits that this is the house where the infamous tragedy occurred, which makes Kathy doubt. But George reminds her that houses don't hurt people. It is other people who do. A few days later, the family moves into the house and has a wonderful first day together, recording the entire process. In the evening, George begins to feel cold, but Kathy doesn't feel the chill. He decides to go down to the basement to add more wood to the furnace. He hears strange noises, which he initially thinks come from the clock radio, but when he checks, he realizes it isn't even plugged in. Then he figures out that the noise is just the wind blowing through the air vent. When George returns to bed, he and Kathy start to get intimate, but George is distracted when he sees Jody's ghost in the room. It vanishes within seconds, but George now feels unwell and decides to end their activities for the night. The next morning, George wakes up with a terrible cough. Kathy hears Chelsea talking to someone, and when she checks, finds her alone. Assuming it's an imaginary friend, Kathy plays along, but Chelsea can actually see Jody's ghost in her closet. Chelsea also draws a picture of Ronald but refuses to say who it is because Jody asked her to keep it a secret. While George is outside chopping wood, Michael approaches him with a strange metal object he found in the basement. George snaps at him and forbids him from going down there, as it will be his office, but he quickly apologizes, with a hug for his reaction. Moments later, George and Kathy hear Billy's dog, Harry, barking loudly. They follow the noise to find Chelsea standing dangerously on George's speedboat, holding a balloon. It takes a few attempts from her parents to get her to snap out of it, and once they pull her away from the water, Chelsea explains that Jody just wanted to see the boat. The family returns to the house, and George ensures that the boathouse is locked. Later that evening, strange noises wake Michael. He wants to go to the bathroom, but since Billy won't wake up to go with him, Michael decides to be brave and go alone. As he walks down the hallway, he notices the boathouse door is open, which frightens him, so he hurries to the bathroom. After using the toilet, he tries to wash his hands, but the water won't come out of the tap. Suddenly, a creepy ghost appears next to Michael, causing the tap to begin dripping blood. Terrified, Michael runs back to his bed, while throughout the house, furniture and windows begin moving on their own. At that moment, George hears a shot and rushes out of the bedroom to check on the boys, unaware that blood is now dripping from a light switch. In the boys' bedroom, George is horrified to see himself standing next to the children's bodies. This twisted version of himself tries to end things for himself, but suddenly George wakes up, realizing it was all just a nightmare, happening at 3:15. He gets out of bed to close the window and notices that the boathouse is open. There is also a balloon coming out of it. Thinking that Chelsea might be inside again, George runs to the boathouse and finds Harry barking at some bubbles in the water. George immediately dives in, but there's nothing there. As Harry continues to bark outside, George follows him and discovers Jody's face on the window. It quickly moves, reappearing next to Chelsea. George rushes inside to double-check and finds Chelsea peacefully sleeping. He then checks the closet but doesn't see Jody, who is being held against the ceiling by eerie hands. However, George does find Jody's bear and decides to leave it in the bed with Chelsea. The next morning, George is in the basement, watching Harry dig at a hole in the wall, which has a mysterious stain on its wood. When Kathy checks on him, George explains that this is the only warm place in the house because someone keeps opening the windows. He also says that Harry woke him up, and when he mentions the boathouse, he reveals that he found the lock keys in Billy's room. George believes it was all a prank, thinking Billy doesn't like him. 2 weeks later, George keeps asking Billy for an apology, but Billy refuses to take the blame for something he didn't do. While Kathy is in the kitchen, the magnets on the fridge move on their own to spell, "Catch them and kill them." Then, she hears the sound of someone running behind her. and when she turns around, she discovers the creepy message. Worried, she goes to look for George, but when she returns and finds him drinking milk, the message is gone. Kathy blames it on her imagination. In the evening, George and Kathy decide to go out on a date. Billy doesn't want a babysitter, but he quickly changes his mind when Lisa arrives, and he sees how attractive she is. Lisa used to babysit for the previous family, and after the parents leave, she tells Billy the whole story. Ronald had first believed his dog was evil and slaughtered it. A few days later, he thought his family were demons and slaughtered them too. She is suddenly interrupted by the arrival of Michael, and while Lisa tells him to cover his ears, he ends up hearing everything anyway. Lisa explains the passings in gruesome detail, and afterward shows them the closet where they had found Jody. Chelsea shows up and shares that Jody says Lisa is an awful babysitter, revealing that it was Jody who got Lisa fired. Billy dares Lisa to enter the closet, and she does, ignoring Chelsea's warnings that it may anger Jody. Lisa finds Jody's bear just before the door suddenly closes behind her, and the boys can't open it from the outside, even though it doesn't have a lock. As Chelsea's drawing toy displays a message saying, "Hate her," the lights begin flickering, and Jody appears in the closet, forcing Lisa to touch the bullet wound on her forehead. Lisa screams in horror as numerous creepy visions appear in front of her, and the boys run to find help. Moments later, an ambulance arrives to take a traumatized Lisa away. George angrily scolds the boys for pulling what he assumes was a dangerous prank, dismissing Billy's claim that the house was responsible. The boys, now terrified after learning about the tragedy, beg not to sleep in their room anymore, but George insists they stay. Meanwhile, Kathy checks on Chelsea, who explains that Jody hurt Lisa because Lisa had been mean to her. Chelsea reassures Kathy that Jody thinks she is a good mom and won't harm her, but Jody despises the bad man living in the house, who forces her to do bad things. The next day, George assigns Billy to work on chopping wood, until late, causing him to miss dinner. Kathy feels George is being too harsh, but George insists Billy needs a strict father figure. Later, while working in the basement, George hears Billy and Michael's voices coming through the vents, insulting him. He also hears a sinister voice urging him to catch them and take them out. When George touches the wall with the hole, he suddenly finds himself in a dark room, filled with strange tables, equipped with taps dripping blood onto the floor. On one table lies a body, and when George approaches, he sees himself saying, "Kill them." The vision abruptly ends, and George rushes to the bathroom, overcome with nausea. Seeking to calm down, he tries taking a bath, but two ghostly arms emerge from the water and attempt to drown him. George struggles desperately, shouting until Kathy arrives and pulls him out of the water. The following day, Kathy takes George to a doctor, but no physical issues are found. George admits he felt better as soon as they left the house, but resists the suggestion to see a psychiatrist, firmly stating that he isn't crazy. At home, Billy is looking after his siblings when Chelsea leaves the table to find her bear. When Kathy and George return, they notice the bear lying outside on the ground. Suddenly, they hear Chelsea's voice and look up to see her calmly standing on the roof of the house. George grabs a ladder while Kathy rushes upstairs, climbs out a window, and carefully follows Chelsea onto the roof. Chelsea explains that she needs to go with Jody, but Kathy manages to grab her just in time. As Kathy begins to lose her footing, George drops the ladder and catches Chelsea as she falls. After the incident, Kathy scolds Chelsea for her reckless behavior, making her cry when Kathy denies Jody's existence. Chelsea insists Jody was taking her to see her dad, leading Kathy to suspect her daughter's actions stem from grief. George overhears and mutters about the family being wacko before gathering his belongings and moving to the basement to stay. Later, Kathy visits Father Calloway, expressing her fears that something evil might be in the house. The priest is unsurprised to learn she's living in the home where the tragedy occurred. Meanwhile, George forces Billy to hold logs steady while he chops wood, frightening the boy as the axe swings dangerously close. When Billy begins crying, George threatens him into staying quiet. That evening, George isolates himself in the basement, watching the tape of their moving day. Suddenly, George sees Billy's face distort into a demonic form. Thinking his mind is playing tricks on him, he decides to go to sleep. At 3:15, he wakes to the sound of voices urging him to kill them. Leaving the basement, George finds all the house doors open. Hearing Harry barking in the boathouse again, George grabs his axe and goes to investigate. As soon as he steps inside, a zombie-like creature lunges at him, and George instinctively defends himself with the axe. It isn't until the creature lies lifeless that George realizes, to his horror, that he has slaughtered Harry. Shaken, he hides the dog's body and cleans the blood from the floor. The next morning, guilt weighs heavily on George. When Kathy suggests they leave the house, he refuses and grips her hand so tightly that he hurts her. This leads to an argument, during which George yells at Kathy, only to be interrupted by the boys asking about Harry. George claims the dog probably ran away, brushing off Billy's insistence that Harry would never do that. Later in the afternoon, Father Calloway arrives to perform an exorcism. He notices Chelsea holding Jody's bear and privately tells Kathy that the bear was buried with Jody and has no reason to be in the house. As Calloway begins the ritual, the doors around him slam shut on their own, and a strange noise emanates from the vent. When he investigates, a massive swarm of flies bursts out and attacks him. As the doors suddenly reopen, the terrified priest flees the house, ignoring Kathy's desperate pleas for help as he hastily drives away. As Kathy turns around, she bumps into George, who reassures her that she has him. When night falls, George struggles to sleep as the voices and the echoes of Harry's barking continue to haunt him. The television suddenly flashes the same disturbing visions Ronald once saw, urging George to slaughter his family. Overwhelmed, George runs outside, desperate to escape the voices. From the window, Kathy watches in concern as her husband collapses, visibly tormented, on the ground. On the 28th day, Kathy decides to visit the library to investigate the house's dark history. She discovers that Ronald DeFeo also heard voices, moved into the basement, and slayed his family after living there for 28 days. She also learns that police had found a notebook with the same cryptic writing she'd seen on the fridge magnets. Digging deeper, Kathy uncovers the house's origins. A reverend had built it under the guise of helping Native Americans, but had instead abused and slaughtered them using cruel methods, including the strange contraption Michael had found in the basement. Alarmed, Kathy rushes to Father Calloway to share her findings. Calloway reveals he had dismissed Ronald's claims of hearing voices, but now believes them, warning Kathy to get her family out of the house immediately. Meanwhile, George, fed up with the relentless whispers, begins breaking through the basement wall with the hole in it. Behind it, he uncovers a mass of writhing worms and a second wall, which he also demolishes. On the other side, George finds the hidden room from his visions, filled with the spirits of the Native Americans the Reverend had slaughtered. At the end of the corridor, George encounters the spirit of the Reverend himself. The specter reenacts the night of his demise. Now, the Reverend's spirit seeks to possess George. George abruptly wakes up and answers the ringing phone. As soon as he hears Kathy urging him to leave the house, he rips the phone off the wall in anger. Meanwhile, Kathy rushes back to the house and finds George in the boathouse, shining a flashlight into the water, seemingly searching for spirits to destroy with the boat's propeller. When Kathy calls out to him, George turns and blinds her with the flashlight, causing her to stumble into the water. Her hair becomes tangled in the propeller, and when George approaches to check on her, he sees a demonic face and switches on the propeller, intending to destroy it. Kathy struggles to free herself until George finally recognizes her true face and stops, allowing her to escape. Kathy runs back into the house and finds Chelsea in the basement, where they discover coffins prepared for the entire family. Suddenly, George appears, behaving eerily, prompting Kathy and Chelsea to flee. They reunite with the boys and attempt to escape, but George grabs a weapon and begins pursuing them relentlessly, overpowering every obstacle they put in his way. The family struggles to find an exit as the house's doors and windows close on their own. George eventually catches up, grabbing and striking Kathy, but lets her go when Billy intervenes and hits him. Chelsea leads the family upstairs to escape through her open window, which used to be Jody's. They climb onto the roof, and when George follows, Billy tears off a piece of metal from the chimney and strikes George, knocking him down and causing him to lose his weapon. The family tries to re-enter the house through another window, but is frightened away by the ghost of the Reverend. Desperate, they descend using the roof stairs, only to find George regaining consciousness and retrieving his axe. George grabs Billy, preparing to slay him as he still perceives him as a demon. Kathy intervenes, threatening George with his own weapon. George challenges her to go through with it, but she cannot bring herself to harm her husband. Instead, she uses the weapon to knock him unconscious. As George lies there, visions of their happier days together flood his mind. When he regains consciousness, he sees himself attacking Kathy with the axe, but quickly realizes it's another vision. Snapping back to reality, George pleads with Kathy to end his life. Instead, she knocks him out again, and with the children's help, ties him up. They drag George's body to the boat, and as they prepare to leave, he wakes once more, overwhelmed by the horrific visions of the tragedy. Billy suggests leaving George behind, but Kathy insists they stick together. The entire family boards the boat and sets off. Once they're far enough from the house, George regains clarity, showing he's no longer under the house's influence, and agrees they must leave it behind forever. The family never returns to retrieve their belongings. Meanwhile, back in the house, Jody's spirit screams in horror as the structure shifts and warps. The clock resets to 3:15, and spectral hands emerge, pulling her spirit away.